Perfect. We should be recording now. So this is the week 6, the evening session for this live online meeting. I'm just saying it so that I know what I'm doing, which is really sad that I have to resort to that, but maybe it tells about my life more than anything else. But I want to hear how things are going and how we can make sure that things are going great for everyone. But just kind of to have a plan so I don't get off track. That's kind of what I had lined up for today. I've been advertising to other groups these evening sessions that we have as well, and I'm totally happy to make these regular. But if another day or another time works better for you, you just let me know as well. I don't have a problem adding extra sessions or whatever, and I don't have a problem also doing smaller groups. What I'd like to share before I ask how life is going, that your exam 1 and your lab practical 1 have now been finished grading. And I went through every single answer 3 times. So I really wanted to make sure that no one gets left out of not getting a similar level of grading than another student. So I'm not happy on one day and another day for another student not as on an as great mood. So it should be very, very consistent across the board. Have you two had a chance to check your updated score?
I did not. I didn't know they were done. I keep looking, so I don't know when you put them in. And I haven't looked recently. I haven't looked probably like in the last day or so to see.
Well,
I don't know
I would encourage you to take this couple of minutes. If you can open another tab or open our course tab and go to your grades and check them, just so you have an idea how it's actually going, because how the software automatically graded them was really brutal. I think if I had been a student, by the time I would have gotten my grade, with the amount of misspelling that I do, I probably would have been somewhere in the corner crying. But once I went through all of them, I tried to eliminate all of those issues with the spelling errors and so on. And while pulling up your grades, I'll also say that I think that the lab practical was a really tough one. I'm going to be careful how I phrase this, but I'm going to be still honest and direct. We share a little bit of responsibilities, that who builds what parts of each course, and yet we try to have courses similar from one section to another. And at the same time, we try to let every instructor to have their own style and own emphasis. Someone else built that lab practical, and it's a good lab practical. It's a good test. But
I can guess, right? I could totally guess who built that lab practical.
Yeah, don't say that I said anything, but I think it is really...
I'm not going to say a word, but I could guess who built it, because I think I took this person's class.
Yeah. Well, that's why I'm not saying names. I love every one of my colleagues, and I think they're amazing.
No, and they're great, but
it's really hard, because I would say that I have done this as a job for 15 years. And I consider I have done histology as well. And I would have had to think a little bit about that practical, even I. So I think that there was some level of challenge. Have you both been able to check your exam score and lab practical score?
I was going to ask you, I don't know how. So here comes my inability. I'm so not tech savvy. I don't know how to add another. I do normally, but not when I'm in one of these. My whole screen is taken up. So how do I?
How about
maybe not?
Ask button.
I know how to do this one.
Oh,
I have some technological intellect here. Okay, so in the videos that you're in, do you see at the top right where there's the line, the box, and the X? It's like a double box.
I'm double box X, yeah.
Click on the double box.
Got it.
Now pull up another internet.
Ah.
I am so giving you extra credit for doing support.
So I'm just going back into my class right now. Got it.
I'll say that this is the best grade that I have gotten on a practical. I'm going to take it. I studied very hard for it, so I'm happy with
all
my
well
grade.
earned, because I honestly say that I didn't make lab practical any easy
Oh, yeah.
in terms of
Okay.
grading. It was a tough lab practical, and I still kept the tough grading. I just eliminated any spelling errors. So you have really earned your grade. If you feel that it went well, you have earned it.
Thank you.
Okay, now how do I come back to you guys? Oh, there I am.
So your internet,
Wait, I can't. It's not letting me. Wait.
yeah, do the same thing for your the new internet tab. Click on that double box.
Yeah.
So now you should have two mini
Got
tabs.
it. Hey. I'm back.
Perfect. But that is so good.
But you never left because we saw your beautiful face the whole time.
Oh, you did? So you saw how excited I was? Because I was thinking, I don't know if I'm gonna really like my grade, but I definitely am good. I'm good with
If
my
I
grade.
ask you now both that how is life going? How is this course going?
Going great.
Okay.
It's going great. Well, going great.
Minus the technology issues. I love learning. Like I said, I love learning about this. So I'm enjoying my class.
Okay, good. That's what I want. And I want you to know one thing, that my philosophy in terms of grading is not just what you get in exams or in assignments. There is room for how much you have actually learned, which matters as well. Not just how well you performed in terms of the scores, but do you feel you learned something? And if you feel you learned something, that carries a lot of weight in your final score.
Yes.
I just think that's what's so much more important, like the whole
Understand
mindset of cramming all this information into a time test that, we've talked about, we're stressed about, and then we're trying to get it all in there and get it. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. And then after the test, you don't even remember what you don't remember any of it, which is,
That's exactly right.
that is for whatever reason, everyone's philosophy on test taking. And
I don't want to be like, oh, life is better somewhere else, because I am here in this country and I'm really happy to be in this country. But that's not the way school works in all parts of the world. So I really feel that you guys are getting, as an instructor, but also as a student, the short end of the stick, because not every country looks at studying the way we are looking here in America.
Yeah, it's not effective.
It's not. And I think there should be more trust on students and instructors of finding other ways than traditional tests. And we're heading to that way. There's some exciting changes coming because of COVID.
I don't perform well on tests. I get there, I have test anxiety. I rush through my test. I'm usually always the first one done, and I walk out of there just like that. And I'm like, I have no idea what I just put on this paper.
Have you considered, and I can't address this to a single student, I'm speaking to an entire class. You do know, and I'm talking about myself as an example, so this is not addressed to any single person. Do you know that accommodation services are not always about things that we immediately think? That, for example, I'm dyslexic, and I never realized that. I never got tested until I was in my early 30s. And I'm thinking back how many exams I have totally balked because to me, the letters just keep changing places.
Mm-hmm.
That would be something that you could get a disability accommodation for. So I'm just putting it out to the universe without addressing any single student, that consider that those accommodations are for everyone, not just for those things that we immediately think of that they could.
Like learning disability or like a total learning Yeah, because I was going to get one, Lindsay, last year for like on the opposite end of the spectrum. I go into a test and I panic at the knowing that there's a clock ticking. I start flipping through the test and I try to find questions that I can get out of the way, and I'll come back to that one because I overthink every question. I can't get through them, and I never finish my test.
And that's the worst way of doing a test, because normally your gut feeling is the right one. We've done a lot of research on that. And usually when you go back to change your question or your answers, you don't improve your grade.
That's true.
But anyways, so we can talk about this. I'm just going to propose that we save it till the end when I've stopped recording. But I really, really recommend to everyone to consider. And the only reason why I share a personal example is that I didn't realize that it would have classified for something, some sort of a support. So I'm just saying that keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about the tests and a little bit about how to take tests and all that at the very end. But I do want to share with you that, like I said, if I had been taking these, either the exam or lab practical, especially the lab practical, I probably would have felt really bad until I would have gotten the corrected score, because the way the automated system grades them, it's really harsh and it's not really reflecting on what you know. So overall, once these 3 cycles had been done, class is doing really well. And I know both of you were doing really well. But if someone at any stage, and I'm just saying this to you because I've said it to everyone and to anyone who's watching this recording, if anyone at any stage feels that I can do even better than this, I am totally open for resitting, exams, practicals, assignments, anything can be retaken. And what I say there on the slide, contact me as soon as possible, that's a little bit of an over-the-top expression. Contact me before the last week of the semester. That's all I need. And let's not do everything again on the last week.
Am I like sending you too many emails?
No.
I send emails too.
I'm an over emailer. I'm like,
No, you don't. And it's really good. And I'll tell you something once I've stopped recording. But you're doing exactly the right things. A couple of hints that I wanted to share with everyone is that those mini essays for extra credit, they are always going to be in my exam. So my approach is that you can always get more than 100% in an exam. So if you hear in a class a hint that this might be a good mini essay topic, that might be something you don't take time away from studying the normal stuff, but you might keep it on your mind that, hey, this is probably something, could I write a little thing about this? I'm not expecting you to write a long thing, but if you write that usually I aim that can bring up your score by 1 grade letter. So I'm just putting it out there. And I think that happened a few times was that some students either they totally panic or they give up or then they just don't think. But if you don't give me any answer at all, it's really hard for me to give even partial points. If you don't know the name of a term and I'm asking a term, think of, can you even guess what that term could be? If you can't guess, tell me something that's close to that. Tell me about function. Tell me about anatomy of that thing. Give me something that I can even give you a partial point for that question. So that's the biggest thing. And the other thing that I do kind of take a blame on myself, because I know that you guys have been taught on these courses that you're always using responders, but you're not always using it if you're taking the course with me. Responders has certain flaws, and I want you to be able to take the test without feeling that you're being monitored with a camera staring at you. Tests can be made reliable and fair, and cheating can be eliminated even without having that. So that's kind of what I had on mind about the hints. Like I said, let's discuss about the exam taking and all that, what sort of options you have. But if it's okay, we could discuss it once I've stopped recording. Sounds good? Yes, maybe.
Got it.
Good. Do you have any questions about the exam or the lab practical at this point? Like general questions other than your personal one. I'm totally happy to go through personal one-on-one as well.
I don't personally think so. I mean, I feel like with the mini essay part, I
Have a look.
I know I ran out of time on that, but other than that,
But I think you still got points for that. Have a look, because I really did spend time writing individual comments to everyone, to almost every question. So have a look through those. There is a lot, and they are usually things that if I say that, oh, this topic will come up later, so good thing you know it. Or if you missed it, that, hey, you really want to know this topic because I will ask it in the next exam as well. So that sort of thing. So have a look through. There was a reason. It's not just that I don't have a life, but it is really that there's a reason why I wrote those feedbacks for everyone. So check those out. And if something's unclear, I use a lot of abbreviations, especially further I get to grading. So ask if something doesn't make sense.
okay.
Good. I'm just going to shimmy along and we'll come back to this if there's questions later. Just as I mentioned earlier on, those Phil's labs that you were doing last week, they are painful. And what I've done now, I've extended, and I'll post an announcement of this to everyone else as well. I've extended them for another 2 weeks. And most of the time, the issues are related to the fact that it's a Flash-based exercise. But I don't want you to spend hours upon hours trying to make it work technology-wise and not getting a chance to actually learn stuff. If it doesn't work, then I will give you an alternative assignment. But what we just did, sharing the screen, I think it took less than 5 minutes, and now it works. So I encourage us, consider that if that's something that would work for you, that you let me know. We'll do it really one-on-one and get it running for you.
Okay.
Good. Maybe. And again, if you do have issues with those, message to me and put there very specifically what it is, which assignment. That kind of overlaps to this slide. I've said this before. Any assignments that you might have missed or where you didn't score the way you wanted to score, you can resit those. You just need to message to me and tell me which one it is. I don't mind how many times you take those. I just want you to take it so that you're not just clicking through it for the 100th time. Try to have a different strategy than before. A lot of these are test-taking techniques rather than how much you actually know. If you have a chance to retake a test, it's always a good idea to look your old test before you retake it. That do I have some hints or have I figured out where I went wrong? Can I make notes of the questions that I keep getting wrong? So if it's an open book test, well, it'd be a good idea to have the notes of what I typically get wrong next to me. Make sense? Just putting it out there. I can't see you because I'm trying to avoid that they don't get recorded on the recording that who was in the classroom. So if you're showing that, no, it didn't make sense, it's not that I'm ignoring you. It's just that I can't see you. But this week, we're going back to what we've been doing before. We have exactly the same homework, everything in the Connect. You have the Learn Smart, which is basically reading the textbook and answering those questions and going through it. As long as you've gone through it, you will get 100%. Then you have the quiz, and I think that the last hard quiz, that was a really large one. A student of mine was telling me that it was 60 questions or something. I didn't even realize that there were that many questions. So if it was a lot, that it didn't go exactly the way you wanted, you can always retake that. Oh, 65, oh my goodness. So If it didn't go the way you wanted, there's always a chance to retake that. This time we're also doing the lab like we did before in the Connect, none of these fills labs, so it should be easier to do. Oh my God, that was a bigger quiz than I realized. So I am totally understanding. I think it's now open again, that quiz as well, for another 2 weeks. And a lot of the time, even if the deadline has gone, most of the activities you can submit late still. And they count. I don't deduct points for late submission. But if it doesn't let you go and do something that you want to do again, email me, or don't email me, send me a message on this course module. And that's simply because there's like 100 emails every day, and not from students, but from other stuff, and things get buried in there. And then you have those practice anatomy things that you've done before, where you have that video where a colleague of mine talks through structures, and then you identify those. So nothing new in terms of the assignments, the same stuff that we've done before. Any questions about this week's assignments?
No.
Good. Well, you are welcome to ask though, but I just can't see you guys. So what I wanted to do now was to go to key points from this week's chapter with you guys. And then if it would be okay, we can jump back to this presentation. Does that sound something that you're okay with? Good. So I'm not kicking anyone out, just bear with me. What I'm doing is that I'm changing the presentation. And at any stage when we're going through that, feel free to shout out. It's not that I'm avoiding anything. I might not just see if you have questions. That might happen as well. So shout out if I'm not answering, if you need anything from me, if there's any questions, anything. So this week, we're moving to the third section of the cardiovascular system. We have already talked about blood, we have already talked about the heart, and now we need to shift our focus on the blood vessels. And blood vessels are really, if you think that blood was the liquid going in this system and heart was the motor pushing that liquid onwards, well, blood vessels are the closed space, the tubing where everything travels then. And remember that not all animals have blood vessels. There's plenty of animals who just have blood-like substance flowing free in their body, in just cavities. And not all animals have a circulation that's one way, but we are going to focus only on humans, and we have blood vessels, and they're one-way blood vessels. Further in your studies, when you get a chance to do comparative anatomy and physiology, and that does get really, really interesting, and it does share the understanding why human evolved the way we evolved. But before we get there, we have to understand the basics. So that's what we're doing this semester. And there's a lot of clinical relevance in that. Understanding nosebleed or bruising can be just normal, but nosebleed or bruising can also be a sign of something really serious. So we need to kind of have an understanding of what's typical, what's not typical. We need to know how high or how low blood pressure has to be before it's a problem. There's many different kinds of blockages. The place where that blockage happens in your cardiovascular system, in your vasculature, is one of the key determinants that how serious it's going to be. So there's a lot of clinical relevance on this chapter. And typically when I ask students to tell me that what kind of blood vessels we have, I get these three. I get arteries, capillaries, and veins. Does anyone know other blood vessels than what have been listed here? There are two. And don't worry if you didn't know them, because there's something that we will be discussing. We have arterioles and we have venules. Arterioles are basically just small arteries. There's something that's between an artery and a capillary. And venules are basically just small veins, something that's between capillaries and veins. But really, whenever we discuss about blood vessels, we try to encourage students to discuss them in this order. Because again, remember, not every country, not every exam, not even in America, every institution does exams the way we do. In some places, you actually write essays as an exam, but you will not have to do that. But it makes sense to discuss blood vessels in the order how blood flows through them. If you jump from one to another, it kind of sends a signal to the grader that you have no idea how they are linked. So that's why we always tend to progress starting with the arteries, because that's where the blood goes from the heart. And that blood is rich in oxygen. It travels from the heart in this kind of very pulsatile manner. If you think heart pushes it out, not at a constant rate, but in kind of pulses, and that's in very high pressure. So arteries have to be adjusted for that kind of thing. By the time we get to the capillaries, we need to slow down the speed of the blood. And we need to make it very low in blood pressure, because if the blood goes through capillaries too fast, it doesn't have time to do that exchange, because it's within the capillaries where all of this exchange of materials happens. But also, if there's too high pressure in the vessels at the capillaries will burst. So we need to do some big change from arteries to the capillaries. So that's one of the big themes that we'll have a look. And once we have finished the capillaries, now we're left with blood that's in very low blood pressure. It's starved from oxygen, so it's very oxygen poor, and it's all over the body, including at your toes, for example. Yet we need to get that blood from your toes to your heart, and most of the time we're standing upright or sitting upright. Getting that blood in a low pressure system back to your heart is going to be a challenge. And we'll have a look how veins have adjusted to that challenge. So those are the big themes that we're going to be talking about today. We'll also have a look of the blood flow, blood pressure, and pulse. And then there is a third section, which is these clinical examples. And it's going to be also special circulations in special parts of the body where there's something odd or something unusual. And those parts, the last parts, I'm saving for you to have a look from the lecture videos, because what's really the most important in this chapter is having an understanding of these vessels in terms of their anatomy and in terms of their physiology. And everything else is just an expansion. Since this is kind of a review session where we only cover the key points. So those lecture videos do cover everything, full story. So are we okay with what I just showed, kind of the different blood vessels? If I don't hear anything, I just like, okay, life is good. I do that actually in a classroom as well. I appreciate you saying yes. I'm half deaf. So on the one ear, I actually don't hear. So I do that in a classroom. If I don't hear anything, I think I'm doing a great job, even if the class isn't like that in a one-on-one in real life. So in my mind, everything's always great. You can also tell who do I like when I go to a dinner party or when I walk with someone, that on which side I ask them to go of me, that do I like them or not. And most of the time they don't know, but I live in this bubble and it works out great for me. But getting back to the blood vessels, all of these blood vessels, we saw that there were different types and they all had different challenges, yet all of these blood vessels contain basically 3 different layers. And we're going to go through these 3 general layers, and then we're going to have a look of all of these special types of blood vessels. But with a few exceptions, all blood vessels have these 3 layers. And these layers are often described when we discuss the anatomy, the language that we're going to be using, as tunics or tunicas. And I'm always trying to think that, okay, how are students going to remember these words? You have to remember that I'm not a native speaker, so I don't know how well you remember these. I don't remember any of that. And I just try to think of, okay, well, there's pieces of clothing that females wear that are tunicas. You kind of put it on top of other pieces of clothing. They're layers of clothing that are get put on top of something else. So all of these layers are known as tunic of something or tunica of something. So if that helps you to remember, great. If it doesn't, I didn't need to go into talking about fashion. I have no knowledge about that. So the 3 layers that you will see in all blood vessels are tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. And these vessels are now listed as if going out towards the out from the middle of the blood vessel. So middle of the blood vessel, the space where blood actually travels, is known as something that we call lumen. So all of these layers are now described going from lumen outwards. So we are going to go through these different layers, but just kind of have an understanding that there is the order matters. Most of the world uses word tunica adventitia for the 3rd layer that we're going to have a look of, but America seems to prefer tunica externa. Either one would be fine, and you can learn and use either one. I'm totally fine with that. But just so you don't get totally surprised if you look at a different textbook and you're like, where did this come from? So actually, these names are not that illogical when you start looking at them and thinking of them. So we're going to start with the tunica intima. That's the layer that's right against the blood within the blood vessel. And if you think of that word, it is in intimate contact with the blood. That sounds a little sketchy, but don't think of it that way. But it is a layer that name tells you it is most closest to the blood actually there. And it is the innermost layer. So this layer is going to look very different from the 2 other layers. And if you go back to the very basic tissue types that you've seen probably earlier on in your courses, you might have seen something like this where you have, if this is a cross-section of cells, a single layer of flattened cells. Well, if you think of the function of tunica intima, it actually makes sense that they're looking like this. We want to make a layer that protects the rest of the blood vessel, but yet we want that layer to be very thin, so it's easy for materials to cross back and forth through it. So we keep these cells as one layer, and we keep them thin, and we keep them so that it's easy to replace them if they get damaged, if they get have to be renewed. So I think that would be our simple squamous epithelia. You might have learned that term to describe them, but there might be other terms that you've seen. But really try to remember that tunica intima, it really serves a purpose, just forming a layer between the other part of the body, between other parts of the blood vessel, and the insides where the blood is. Then the next layer is tunica media. And again, if you think of its middle layer, media layer, if you were to write to me in an exam that it's a medial layer, I would be totally happy with that. Just as long as you're close with the term, I will go with that. So that's the thickest layer out of these 3 that you end up finding in blood vessels. Often that contains elastic tissue and muscle tissue. And you remember we had smooth muscle in few different places. We had smooth muscle in our digestive system as kind of controlling the flow of food through your alimentary canal, forming sphincters, squashing things, all that sort of things. But we also have smooth muscle around our blood vessels. And they play a very important role, and especially on our arteries. And we'll have a look of that as well a little later. But tunica media, the thickest layer, a lot of connective tissue, a lot of smooth muscle tissue. Huge difference if you compare to tunica intima, which was just a single simple layer of cells. And the last layer, or there's a picture of smooth muscle. I try to put pictures so I remember to tell about all the things. And this brings us actually, before I go to the last layer, to the concept that we've kind of touched upon already with the heart, but we have not applied it in terms of the blood vessels. Once we start talking, that's my cat meowing for me. Cat is in Finnish kissa, so I was going to say the name of it in Finnish. But anyways, so blood vessels deal with controlling the blood pressure. In addition to kidneys controlling that, in a long-term adaptation, in a short-term, blood vessels themselves can adjust your blood pressure. So if you want to generate a higher blood pressure, the blood vessels will constrict, and that will cause more pressure to the blood. If you want to lower your blood vessel, the blood vessels will dilate and your blood pressure will go down. So that's the function of the smooth muscle, what they do, and why do we have them at the tunica media. I didn't realize that you can see only the tail from the camera, so that must have looked weird earlier. The last layer, tunica externa or tunica adventitia, if you wish. I don't really know how to come up with a mnemonic to remember the adventitia. I just think of that we have something, and I don't know if this is only in Lutheran religion, but we have something called Advents before Christmas. That's towards the end of the year. So that's how I think of, Adventitia is towards the end of the structure of the blood vessel layers. But tunica externa, that's probably even more obvious. It's the most external layer of the blood vessel. Their function is really just to anchor these blood vessels where they should be, so that the blood vessels wouldn't move around a lot throughout our life. The other thing that they do, they reinforce these other structures that are there. But what we end up finding in tunica externa is a lot of nerve supply and also a lot of lymphatic vessels. And we'll talk about lymphatic system after we talked about cardiovascular system, because these two are actually kind of complementary. It's almost like the piping in a house and then the drainage system in a house. And I think we never spend enough time really talking about lymphatic system in most of our courses. So on this course, I try to make time that we at least mention it. So these are the three layers that we end up finding. And all of those, if you think, have their special characteristics. Like, to really summarize and keep this as a review session of the review session, tunica intima, we're keeping it very thin, very simple, so that crossing of materials is easy. Simple squamous epithelium. Tunica media, thickest layer, middle layer, a lot of connective tissue, a lot of smooth muscle tissue, controlling the vessel diameter. So vasoconstriction or vasodilation, which was all about kind of short-term responses to need to change the blood pressure. And finally, tunica externa, that was just to put the blood vessels where they should be, strengthening them. A lot of interaction with other body systems, so a lot of nervous supply, a lot of lymphatic vessel supply. So that's the overview of these blood vessels. And what I wanted to show was to show this diagram, and it looks super busy, but don't try to learn all about it just now. But you want to see, first of all, that both arteries and veins have these three layers. So they have the tunica intima, which is the most inner part, right connecting to the lumen of the blood vessel. Then you have tunica media, which is the middle part, a lot of smooth muscle, a lot of connective tissue. And then finally, you have the tunica externa that basically just anchored it where it needed to be. But now we are ready that we've kind of had a quick look of this overall. We're ready to actually see the differences between arteries and veins. There's not a lot of differences in either one of them in terms of the tunica intima. You can see that it's this layer, single layer of flattened cells. Again, their function is to make sure that crossing stuff from the blood to the interstitial fluid or to the tissues, that distance is short. And also crossing stuff from there back to the blood, that distance is short. But the biggest difference that we see between arteries and veins is in terms of the tunica media. Focus especially on the thickness of this smooth muscle layer. You'll notice that arteries have way more smooth muscle than veins. Arteries also have way more elastic tissue, connective tissue there, elastic tissue, than our veins, where I don't see that this diagram would show any. There is some in the veins, but not to the same amounts. That is because we discussed earlier on that arteries have a very different need for what they are to do than veins. So arteries are dealing with this pulsatile blood flow as heart contracts and shoots out blood and then again relaxes, gets ready to shoot out more blood. Also, the blood that's shooting out of the heart, it's coming out of there with high pressure. So arteries have to be able to respond to that. Not only that they can't be like veins that are actually very thin in terms of their wall thickness. This picture quite doesn't do justice to that. So arteries are much more thicker than the veins. They are thicker so that they can handle this. I don't think veins could even necessarily handle this amount of pressure, this amount of changes in the pressure, this amount of pulsatile flow. So arteries are adapted to that. But another thing that arteries do, they try to even it out. So when there is a high flow of blood, it tries to smoothen it out. And when the flow is temporarily slower, it tries to make sure that that pressure remains. So that's where the smooth muscle layer and elastic tissue serve, that they kind of smoothened out the pulsatile and high pressure tendency of the blood coming out of the heart. A good example of a typical artery would be our aorta, the first vessel coming out of the heart. That's where we really need all this. We really need all these smooth muscles. That's where we really need all this elastic tissue. And you saw that veins don't really have. And finally, the tunica externa, that's present on both. That function is just simply to anchor these blood vessels, but also to make sure that we are reinforcing them where needed. Then when you look closer and we start looking at the capillaries, capillaries only seem to have the tunica intima layer. And that's partially true. We'll have a look at different kinds of capillaries. So although I said that all blood vessels have these, in proportion, capillaries are mainly tunica intima. And one more thing that I do want to highlight about the veins at this point, and we'll come back to this later on, there's an adaptation that we've not seen anywhere else in the blood vessels other than in veins. And you've seen, we talked about the valves earlier on in our chapter about the heart, how the function of the valves was to facilitate one-way flow of the blood and prevent it from returning the other way. And that's going to be the key and explanation to when I ask you, how do we get blood from your toes back to your heart? Because we're working against gravity. There's low pressure. And there's not things like your heart doesn't suck the blood back into the heart. So there has to be something else. And the valves will be part of that answer. So once we get there, I know you all are going to be so excited to hear what the explanation is. So that's the big picture. And now we're going to take a little bit of time to review each of these three blood vessel types in a little bit more detail. And we're going to start with the arteries. And what we notice about arteries is what I've already highlighted. Blood pressure is high in them, and the flow of blood is very pulsatile. So when you take a pulse of an individual, that's always going to be from an artery, because that allows us then to count the number of heartbeats that one has, because we're getting this pulsatile flow, we're still able to sense it. I've often thought that what if you would have a completely artificial heart that would pump the blood out at the constant rate? How would that change the rest of the body? I don't know. I haven't yet gotten that far in my thinking. But these are the things that keep me awake at night. Too much information. This picture that I show is actually a microscopic picture. And the reason why I like showing it is that it's very lucky slide. We're seeing an artery on the left-hand side, and we're seeing a vein on the right-hand side. So the blue arrows or turquoise arrows are pointing to an artery, and the white arrows are pointing to a vein. And if you look at them, their walls are very, very different. This is actually how we are able to tell on a dead person, on a cadaver, that which vessels were arteries, which were veins, because you're not going to get a pulse on a dead person, so you're not going to be able to tell that, oh, these that have pulsatile flow, these are going to be arteries. What we find instead, that once you remove the blood from a dead person, all of the veins will collapse, because their walls are so thin. There's not that elastic, there's not that much of that smooth muscle. Their walls just collapse and they become like tubes that have just closed off until you fill it up again. Arteries instead remain fairly round, and you can see that rich amount of connective tissue there, the elastic tissue as well, that's contributing to that. So that's the reason why I included that picture. I hope that it doesn't confuse more than do good. But I think it's always good to show that I'm not just making up these things. There's different kinds of arteries as well, depending on where in the body we are and what part of the body we're looking. So the very first arteries that we get coming out of the heart are the elastic arteries. So they are very rich in amount of that elastic tissue. They're able to deal with this blood pressure fluctuation. They're able to deal with this pulsatile flow. They're able to deal with this high pressure. And then when you continue further, you can do a division that these would be conducting arteries. Elastic arteries could be considered as conducting arteries. They are considered as the place where we manipulate, that we maintain the constant blood pressure. So we are able to still have a blood pressure in the cardiovascular system, even though heart doesn't give us a constant blood pressure. It goes from high pressure to low, high, low. It is thanks to our elastic arteries, which maintain that we have more consistent blood pressure. So they're sometimes referred as conducting arteries. Muscular arteries instead don't have as much elastic tissue, they have more muscle tissue, and this was going to be our smooth muscle. They are often referred as distributing arteries. So they're a little bit further down the road, and their function is to make sure that blood goes to wherever it's needed. We have more blood vessels in our body and we have blood. So certain parts of the blood vessel system are closed at all times. Just what part is closed and what part is open, that varies depending on what we are doing, what are the needs of the body, what's going on in life. And the last one that I've shown there are our arterioles. If you try to, this is probably a good illustration of that. They are something between of what we have just discussed of arteries and a capillary. So I don't expect you to know a huge amount of arterioles, but I do expect that you are familiar with the name at least. So you can answer next time that no, there's more than just 3 types of blood vessels. There's all these ways of looking. Now comes the first super important topic that I think that most students haven't seen before. taking this course, and you might have seen, if you have, good for you. But because I said that there's more blood vessels when you combine the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, then there is blood in the body. So we have to choose where we direct the blood. And usually the decision is done by opening and closing different areas of capillaries. So there's a lot of capillaries. So by choosing that this capillary network we close off, there's not much use for it at this moment. We are making sure that, okay, we don't need blood there. And then if there's a part where we really want to keep active, where we really want to direct blood, we make sure that the blood flows there. And how we do this decision is through these structures that are known as precapillary sphincters. So these are simple, tiny muscle bands just where your arterioles end and your capillaries start. They're a little bit like a structure that either is closed or open. So they control to what capillary the blood starts to go. In this picture, you would see an artery, and you would see a vein, and you would see the arteriole and venule, and then you would see a lot of capillaries. This would be now an area where we're directing blood to all parts of the capillary network. For example, after you've eaten, your blood gets directed to your intestines because we're now focusing on getting all of the nutrients, getting all of the energy extracted from that food that you just ate. When you are having a fight or flight response, fighting for your life, digestion is the last thing on our mind. So then we shut this off. And if you want to see an illustration how it would look when you shut it off, here these precapillary sphincters are now closed, and we are basically just passing the blood from an artery to a vein and skipping this entire capillary network. So that's the function of these precapillary sphincters. And again, shout out if you feel that I'm going too fast, if you have questions. Otherwise, I'll just go through the key points and we can come back. Well, that's all I wanted to say about arteries. Now we get to the capillaries. And you remember capillaries were very thin. Their main function is to be the site where really an exchange of materials happens. And that exchange can be gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. It can be nutrients. It can be waste products. It can be hormones. It can be anything really. I'm just looking because my cat is running around like crazy. So let's have a look at capillaries. There's an illustration of those. If you compare to that, to what we've seen before, those walls are thin. It's mainly the tunica intima that we see there. It's mainly the single layer, simple stratified epithelium that we're starting to see there. So that the distances for the exchange are minimally short. If you have any questions, just shout out. Well, there's different kinds of capillaries. There's 3 that I want to introduce to you. And again, it might seem that, oh my God, there's all these weird words, but actually these words will make sense once we go through. We are going from capillaries that are most closed, most continuous, to capillaries that have a huge amount of gaps. So we're moving in an order from very well closed capillary to very open capillary. And you'll see what I mean with the pictures. So continuous capillaries, the name of that refers to the fact that the epithelial layer inside is continuous. There's no gaps between one cell and another cell. So what you will see on this is the blood vessel or the capillary. You will see the nucleus of these cells that form the tunica intima in the capillaries, and you will see one red blood cell. You remember that smallest capillaries, red blood cells are just able to squeeze through, not much more. So that's our continuous capillaries. Let's compare them to our fenestrated capillaries. Actually, a term fenestration, and I don't know if this is a word that you would use in English, but I know that you would use it in French for sure. Fenestration in French would refer to a window. So this type of a capillary has a lot of little windows in it. And these windows are there so that materials can come in and leave easier. So we're making that exchange even easier than just having to cross through that tunica intima. We're actually giving gaps for stuff to move back and forth there. So fenestration means a window, and in this case, this type of a capillary has windows all over it. And I don't mean the computers. The last type of capillaries is our sinusoidal. You know, you've got sinuses, you've got these empty places in your skull where you can get then an inflammation and you get sinusitis and so on. Sinuses are empty spaces. So sinusoidal capillaries have empty spaces on their walls. These are now way bigger than those fenestrations that we saw before. We actually see that there's parts of this capillary wall, parts of this tunica intima, which is the main layer that we see in capillaries, missing. So exchange of stuff is really easy from these. So that's our capillaries, kind of as a quick summary. And if you're still okay to continue with me, I want to say a few words about the veins. And we remember when we think of the veins, we had high blood pressure on arteries, that blood was very pulsed up, but by the time we got to the capillaries, that blood pressure had to turn to low, so we don't burst the walls of the capillaries. Well, that blood pressure doesn't pick up after we finish capillaries. So blood pressure is still low in veins. We have very little oxygen because most of the oxygen has been picked up at the capillaries and exchanged to the body tissues. And now we are transporting blood back to the heart. So let's have a look what we can tell about veins. You do have your venules, which are just basically smaller versions of veins. So this is where I said that we have to figure out a way. Okay, you've got a low blood pressure, yet you need to get blood from the very bottom of your body all the way back to the heart. And normally I ask from my students the question that how do you get blood back to your heart before showing this picture and before giving all the clues that I've said. And normally I get them telling me that, oh, the blood is just pushed so hard. Well, that's not, because then the capillaries would burst. Then some of the students tell me that, no, your heart just sucks the blood in. No, heart doesn't suck that strongly. That contributes only very little. How the blood returns back to the heart is actually thanks to the thin layers of your veins. Your veins have very thin layers and they have these valves. These valves are the key to this story. Valves prevented the flow backwards, down. For example, if we're talking about blood that's returning from your big toe to your heart, it doesn't allow blood to shoot back down. So they make sure that every time we get blood a little up, it only has one way to go. And the reason why these valves are able to do this job and the blood gets pushed going upwards is because veins are constantly being constricted, constantly being squashed by our skeletal muscles. So that's why you hardly ever see a human being being totally still, or an animal for that matter. Cats, dogs, if you have any of those as pets, you'll notice that even during the night they move a little. Same goes for humans. If you ever have tried to be completely still, it becomes extremely uncomfortable because your body is meant to be moving constantly a little. And the reason why it's moving constantly a little, that by moving a little, we constantly keep squeezing these veins a little, and with every squash, we are pushing that blood back towards the heart. Some of the biggest causes for these squeezes are our respiratory movements in our diaphragm or in our thoracic cavity, also in our abdominal cavity at the top parts. So all of these movements that we're doing are helping veins to return the blood back to the heart. Have you ever seen individuals who are in military parades or some other similar situations where they have to stand still for a long time with their knees locked. Well, that's very common in UK, where I spent past 8 years before I moved here, and this is what tends to happen there. People pass out, that's absolutely. So if you think that the function of the veins was to get blood back to the heart, well, when you are not longer doing that, you are not getting enough blood back to your heart, and the first organ that's gonna go like, oh crap, I'm not getting enough blood, this is not good, is gonna be your brain. So your brain is always what we preserve. What would be the quickest way to get blood quickly to the brain? Well, let's get that person to lie down. And that's why you pass out, because now it's easy to get the blood to the brain. So really, body is taking care of itself. Like we discussed before we started this class, the human body is actually surprisingly smart. So passing out serves a purpose in that sense. And that is because now these veins are not being used, these veins are not being constricted, these valves are not being able to do their job because we don't have that skeletal muscle movement. So this process of returning blood back to the heart through the skeletal muscles, constricting thin walls of veins where we have these valves, this process is known as venous return. And here, clearly, it has failed. So that's why if you're ever being asked to stand still, try to move even a little bit. Same happens if you're sitting for a long time in an airplane. I used to travel a lot every second week from America to Europe or the other way around. If you're still for a really long time, that's not great. You try to move a little bit to make sure that your veins are able to do their job. There's another thing that's interesting that comes from this very unique buildup of the veins, and that's something known as varicose veins. I don't know if you Americans call them that, but in some other places we call them also spider veins, a little bit because of how they look. But varicose veins, they are actually a result of these valves. Oh, perfect. Thank you for educating me about America. You use both. So these are when your veins start failing. You have your valve. It works here, but the valves higher up have failed, and blood has pooled up against this one of the valves, and the walls of the veins have started to become stretched. So blood has started to pool up here. I don't know if I can find a pen here. So all of a sudden, this wall structure starts to expand. And that's what causes your varicose veins. So I'm always very excited when I've talked about this and I go home and I go like, I know why you've got varicose veins. It's not really the best way to make friends, so try not to do what I do, but try to see relevance to what you see in the world. So some people, varicose veins are dilated and painful veins because of these valves leaking higher up. Here they are failing, but lower down they are still working. And as a result, the blood pools up here. Some people get more varicose veins than others. There's really no one reason why some people get them, some don't. It is common that they become more common over age. It is common that you tend to see more of those on individuals who are doing a job where they're standing a lot, things like that. But it doesn't mean that because you're doing a job where you're standing a lot, you must have varicose veins. Your genetics play a role in terms of whether you are going to get those. If you have some sort of a blood flow issue, that might also impact whether you get varicose veins or not. And if you have a high blood pressure, especially on your veins, that can end up breaking these valves. So again, that's the reason why we're monitoring the blood pressure, not just for the other reasons, but it can have effect on the valves of the veins. So that's what I had to say about those, that kind of basic introduction to the wall structure, general wall structure, basic introduction to our arteries, capillaries, and veins. Do we have any questions about those at this point? I know that it's a little quick, but this is really kind of a review and highlighting what are the important parts. If you have any questions, you can shout out now, you can shout out later. It's not like one of those wedding things that speak now or forever be quiet. I'm glad that you say that it looks good, you feel kind of good of the material. What I would like to do, excellent, you're feeling good. What I would like to do is discuss one more concept with you, or set of concepts. That's the blood flow, blood pressure, and pulse. And then we wrap up. Just because we have focused now quite heavily on anatomy, I think it's nice to bring the physiology aspect as well. So whenever we're talking about blood flow, we are talking about how much of blood goes through, whether it's a blood vessel, whether it's an organ, whether it's a part of the circulatory system, in one set amount of time. So normally we measure it as milliliters per minute. But it doesn't just have to be a blood vessel. So I just want to highlight that it can just as well be an organ. We can talk about the blood flow through a kidney. That's one of the indications of how healthy you are. And that's one of the indicators that we use whether we can give you contrast agent when you're getting X-ray or you're getting an MRI data. So that the concept of blood flow is relevant in other systems as well when we talk. Next thing that I wanted to talk with you guys is the blood pressure. So often every one of us know what a blood pressure is, but it's hard to verbalize it. This is kind of a nice definition that I found, that it's the amount of force that's pushed against the wall of that blood vessel. So we measure the blood pressure as millimeters of mercury. So it's some sort of a force, how much we're pushing out from the inside of the blood vessel, from the lumen, against the wall of the blood vessel. Well, when we go and get our blood pressure measured, we normally get two numbers. And these numbers have changed a little bit in the years that have gone by. And these numbers have changed a little bit depending whether you're in Europe or whether you're in America. But usually they're in a range of something like 120 over 80 or 120 over 90 millimeters of mercury. So why don't we just have one number for a blood pressure? Well, the explanation is in what we just learned about the heart. So that's why we needed to talk about the heart before we can talk about blood vessels. Because at times the heart is contracted and we're pushing that blood out of the heart with high force, high blood pressure. That gives us our systolic blood pressure. At the times when the heart and especially the ventricles are dilated, they're relaxed, we get our diastolic blood pressure. So that's why you get two numbers when you measure your blood pressure. So systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Those are, I would want you to know those terms, and I would want you to know a rough idea what's a typical blood pressure. The thing to remember here is that we all are different. What we are teaching in these classes are just generalizations. Some people typically just have a higher blood pressure, and some people just typically have a lower blood pressure. So that's why every time that you go to see a doctor, you go to see a nurse, you go to see other healthcare worker, we do like to take your blood pressure. Not because we're hoping to find at that very moment something shocking. It's also so we build up that record, what's your normal blood pressure. So we have some sort of a baseline to compare against when something happens. Yeah, we do an average. And really, it differs from where you take the blood pressure as well. So they should be taking the blood pressure from the same place every time. But they don't always. That is true. And I have to admit, I'm one of those people whose blood pressure shoots up. They should say if there's a trend. My blood pressure shoots up when a doctor takes my blood pressure. When I take it myself, I'm doing totally fine. That's normal. That's actually telling us that your other body systems, especially your nervous system and autonomic nervous system, is working, that your blood pressure climbs when you see a doctor. Many of us don't hang out with doctors as patients, so we're not used to that, at least a lot. So there's different factors that affect your blood pressure. It can be the amount of total liquids that you have in your cardiovascular system, so the total volume of blood. It can also be dependent on your cardiac output, how much your heart actually pumps blood out in a minute. It also depends how much your blood vessels are forcing resistance to the flow of that blood. And also if that blood has some sort of changes, say for example, if it's more viscose or less viscose, all that sort of thing. So many factors affect, but this is a formula that we end up seeing here again. We love in physiology different formulas to explain. So your blood pressure is a result of multiplying your cardiac output and your peripheral resistance. Well, the reason why this formula is useful is not really just calculating your blood pressure, but because you know the basic math, you can always arrange the formula in another way. We can, for example, figure out our cardiac output as long as we know our blood pressure and we know our peripheral resistance. Or we can figure out our peripheral resistance as long as we know our blood pressure and our cardiac output. Well, we can measure our blood pressure and we can easily figure out our cardiac output as well. So these three numbers can be used to figure out one of them. And that was the picture that I had to remind ourselves, the white coat syndrome that you discussed. And it is a real thing that we get a little nervous. It's the same when you go to a doctor and they test your reflexes. I don't know if it just shows my age, but back when I was younger, it was common that they test your reflexes. Do you work normally? And you're really nervous there that, oh, now they're going to hit my knee. Is my knee going to really move the way it should? Or is it not? Should I over-exaggerate? Shouldn't I? So that's just the way we people are. We're silly. So that brings us to the last big theme that I wanted to mention, and that's our pulse. So pulse, what is a pulse? Why do we take it? It's the number of heartbeats per minute. So really, pulse can be used to determine your heart rate. And typically that's somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute. That varies depending on many factors, depending on your sex, depending on your size, depending on your level of athleticism, depending on your health state. I used to work with athletes quite a lot when I was doing sports medicine. I had some athletes that were really, really professional athletes and were training super hard, who had a resting heart rate of 40 or even 30. And that's really creep when you're expecting to see a number that's totally awful. But it is something that can be also changed based on other changes in your body, based on the level of training, athleticism, and so on. This is how we see the pulse and what we are actually seeing. We are seeing this fluctuation of when we were talking about the blood pressure earlier on. We see the systolic and diastolic values that we're measuring. So this is the fluctuation with the Oh, I agree. So normally how you're supposed to take the pulse, so I'm reading a comment in case someone's wondering what I'm doing. Normally when you're taking a pulse, you are supposed to measure a patient's heart rate for the full minute. And a lot of the time, nurses are, or whoever is taking the pulse, they're looking at the watch, but they're still able to talk. I can barely walk and do chewing gum at the same time. I could never talk and take the heart rate. So, but that's probably just because I'm a man. But what happens is that a lot of the time we cheat. A lot of the time we only take it for 30 seconds, or we might take it only for 15 seconds, and then we multiply. That is bad practice. You're really supposed to take it for the full minute. But bad things happen in life, and that's not the worst thing that happens. But that does happen. So good professional would do the full minute. Does that always happen? No. And that tends to steer us towards the risk of misjudging the heart rate as well, because we're expecting of some sort of a number. But that's the basic concept of the pulse, and that's the reason why we always take the pulse from the arteries. We never take the pulse from the veins, because we don't have this fluctuation. So in a way, that fluctuation is really convenient for us, so we get that heart rate figured out. Where do you take the pulse? Normally from your radial artery at the wrist. There's many other places. There's even places at your feet or behind your knee or at the groin area. That's kind of a one that I would avoid if you are working in a healthcare field, unless you have no other choice. You tend to get a little bit of trouble for that. So this is just to say that pulse, if you don't find it in one place, there are other places where you might find the pulse then. And you'll be surprised, sometimes you get a patient who doesn't have upper limbs. You have to be able to figure out another place to get the pulse. You have to be able to figure out another place to take the blood pressure from. So it's just the reality of the life. The very last thing that I'm showing, and this is more of just me showing this to the screen and saying that, hey, you remember this? You might remember this homeostatic mechanism that I showed in previous chapters. And I said that I will come back to this in many, many systems. Well, now we're coming back to this. So rather than me giving you a big table or a big diagram where arrows go here and there, we can simplify how blood pressure is regulated in short term just by using this diagram that we've learned before. So let's have a look what's happening. Your blood pressure is not what it normally is in our set point. Our normal blood pressure, let's say that it's 120/90. Now we are seeing that blood pressure is something else. Well, we're sensing it by a mechanism that's known as baroreceptor or chemoreceptor reflex. These are structures that are located at your carotid sinuses, your aortic arch, and at your large vessels. You don't need to worry too much about what they are, how they work, but you somehow sense that your blood pressure is now off from what the set point normally would be. Remember, the sensors themselves don't do analyzing. They simply measure or detect something and pass the message to the control center. On most of the time, on us humans and other animals, the control center is going to be your brain. To be more specific, in case of the blood pressure, it's your medulla that regulates your blood pressure, or that's where the primary blood pressure regulation center is. And you remember the set point. Now we are noticing that we have some sort of a change. We're detecting it with this baroreceptor or chemoreceptor reflex, and our medulla notices that it's off from set point. What can we do to regulate blood pressure in short? Well, we can give patient medication. That's a quickly acting medication. Probably a better way than giving the medication is we can give fluids, that's absolutely true, or we can even get rid of some of the fluids if needed. the best thing probably to do would be to treat the cause, why their blood pressure is high. So we always want to get to the original root of a problem, not just that let's treat them and drug them up and send them on their way. Or in a short term, your blood vessels might automatically treat the blood pressure issues by doing this vasodilation or vasoconstriction by the smooth muscles that surround the blood vessels. How about and lifestyle changes? Absolutely stopping smoking, eating less salty food, eating less greasy food, being more active. Heart and your cardiovascular system, it is really a muscle. A heart and your cardiovascular system you can train just as you can train any other muscle. It is no fun. So one advice that I heard, every one of us should get a little out of breath once every day. And when I think of that, I enjoy that I can drive everywhere, even to places where I wouldn't need to drive. So I don't know if we're really getting to that, but absolutely the lifestyle changes. I had never seen a drive-through ATM. I had never seen a drive-through pharmacy until I came to America. I'm telling you, rest of the world doesn't know how your life can be simple. I'm like, anything that I can do out of my car now, I do. I had never seen a drive-through movies or drive-in movies. My life has never been the same after I experienced all these things. How about in long term? How do we regulate your blood pressure in long term? Where your textbook gives you this nice diagram, and I'm saying nice with a sarcasm on my voice. There's a lot of steps and there's a lot of information. You don't need to know that. All you need to know at this point is that your kidneys would be the main long-term regulator of your blood pressure. And we can do that through what you just suggested by regulating the fluid amounts. So long term, if you have too high blood pressure, your kidneys will start to remove some of that liquid from your blood and you will end up urinating it away. If you have too low blood pressure, your kidneys will say, okay, we're no longer producing urine as much as we normally would. So you're conserving those fluids into the blood. There is a complex series of mechanisms that's known as renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, or sometimes just renin-aldosterone mechanism. That's just to tell that there's a lot of steps to get the kidneys to do this. And then there's another mechanism, which is just a direct mechanism. In this, kidneys do it immediately without all these extra steps in between. You don't need to know this to this level. You just need to know the kidney's vital role in regulating the blood pressure. Really, the goal of regulating blood pressure is to make sure that we have high enough blood pressure so we get the tissue perfusion, we get blood to the tissues, and we get blood leaving the blood vessels and going to the tissues, but not too high so that the blood vessels burst. And a good example of that would be to look at what happens in a brain. If your blood pressure is too low, you're not going to get enough materials from the blood being exchanged with the brain tissues. And as a result, you're not getting enough oxygen and you will become unconscious. If you have too high blood pressure in the brain, for example, you might end up having a stroke. So it's all about finding that balance. And on that happy note, we have covered what I wanted to cover about this lecture with you guys. Like I said, we will have in our material a little bit about the special circulations, and we will have a little bit about the clinical relevance of these processes. Did that make any sense? Was that kind of a reasonable explanation summary? Was that too quick?
No, that was great.
Okay, good. You know the key points. That's what I want, that you're kind of set for success. And remember, before our, we will still do that revision and everything. But we have gotten through quite a lot. Do you have any questions about this chapter?
Not yet.
Not yet. We'll get there. And remember, I'm always available for us to tackle those even the following week. I'm just showing this again, that you can have tutoring from the school. You can have tutoring that we can do one-on-one sessions. And I'm definitely committed to doing weekly sessions with you guys. I have the room for questions, but really we have covered the big deals that I really wanted to cover. Like I said, I am leaving these special circulations and the clinical considerations to those lecture videos, and I am going to upload them right after this video, or after I've uploaded this session's video tonight. So they are going to be there. YouTube, I think that one day they're going to start charging me with the amount of crap that I load there, but that's just the future. I'll deal with it when it happens. But
YouTube has everything.
tired with me. So that's all I had for tonight. But what I was going to propose now, I'm going to stop recording unless you have some specific questions. And we can do that chat about that we were going to talk a little bit about taking exams and stuff. Does that sound okay for everyone?
Sure.